Broken Thing, Chapter 22. After he pulled his link from the shell of his body on the citadel, Sanar Tualan considered his name, his names, his identities, and what they had taken from him, what he had taken from them. The galaxy was on its own now. Shepard would only be a remembered voice, recordings and moments of brief time that others would remember of her. She had passed her guarded and flickering torch to her bondmate, a man who would carry it for her, who had done so without being asked after her first death, who would do so again. He could forge faith and trust from doom and darkness. Sanar considered her name, her names, her identities, and what she had taken from them, what they had taken from her, what he had taken from her. He considered the protective gentleness of Garrus Fanning's talons in her hair, his cradling arm holding every lie and every truth. He had given up the opportunity for answers and pure defiance in order to follow the dictates of his Ava. Sanar would never have survived the first 10 minutes as a captive slave under the circumstances she faced. Sanar would not have turned aside from obliterating even the shadow of the man he hated. Inspiring. Disappointing in ways he could not define. Exalted and defiled impressions spilled in and scattered in his mind. Some too familiar to see clearly because they were made of him, some too foreign to catalogue. But he would try. Garrus Fanning's eyes were now twin suns in blue and unforgettable. If one had wished to see what love was, one need only look in his eyes. Her captivity had begun with a test of whim and destiny. Sanar found himself tested, his victory exalted and defiled by Garrus Fanning. Gegerin Itran had been in a room alone with the man before, but seeing him through Kara's eyes and feeling the words on her tongue as she wished to set him free, warn him, keep him safe. Garrus Fanning had not been broken. He also had not been able to claim anything but the shell of the woman he loved and a few minutes of painful confession. It was clear that their bond was true, that Garrus Fanning had honored and loved her, and would have, regardless of anything she gave him or took away from him. Something again that Sanar could not comprehend, did not envy in its results, but envied in its grace. The Taurian had carried her when she could not walk, spoken for her when she could not speak, and her fire had caught in his heart and blazed, where Sanar had only coveted her warmth and brightness. Cara herself had her own impressions of her worth to the Turian, and she had been wrong. She had, as always, minimized her own inspiration. Sanar had failed to predict the man because Cara herself did not imagine herself that loved for that long. She she considered herself to be a mistake the Turian had made. That had allowed Sennar to extend that into further doubt in her mind, but he should have been able to grasp the truth, and had not. Sennar did not believe in justice or rightness, but she was in his mind now, and she inspired those things in him. He had once believed, and it appeared Garrus Fanning had inspired him to wish in some universal way to measure the man against his own beliefs. Now that all prices had been paid and all choices made, what Sennar had achieved was unsurpassed in audacity and creativity, and so low and petty as to rob it of glory. She was glorious. Garrus Fanning was glorious. Sennar was small and dark, and upon examination, unworthy of the gifts he stole. In the end, they had insisted upon each other, and neither had been given to hate, but had furthered the causes of hope and light. Sennar Tulan was in that moment not a perfect foil to her as he would like to see himself, but only a determined obstacle to something that had the potential to not be a foil, but a setting. If one wished to see the perfect setting for Cara Fanning, it was in Garrus Fanning's arms and eyes. Even he could see that, could not unsee it. This was not to say that he'd change a moment of any decision he had made. He had no regrets. He was free. He had the blessings and curses one would wish to have to lead an interesting and fulfilling life of passion, exploration, art, and creativity. His methods had been, as she had told him long ago, cheap and vile. But what he had built, what he would build, it was not empty because it was filled with her. It mattered that it had been taken from her chosen, with Sennar hoping that Garrus Fanning could be a historical footnote in her life and mind, something Sennar could supplant and replace and eclipse. Garrus Fanning had known better, and now so did he. If one sought why one would not worship gods any longer, one need only look in Garrus Fanning's eyes as he chose to walk away. The Turian, a scion of justice and honesty, had been betrayed by any rightness, any power that might have watched over him as he sought to watch over others. Garrus and Cara were as alike in hope and heart as Cara and Sennar were alike in mind and body. Sennar Tulan had defied rightness, gods, and her, and won. And yet his whim had not defeated her destiny. She had not been a channel to revealed gods, only to dark and avaricious creatures she opposed and channeled to her use, Reapers, Leviathan, and Sennar. In the end, there was no fate, there was no pattern, there was only what was forged. There was only her and what she forged. In one way, that was deeply disappointing, hoping to provoke gods into action and failing. It was deeply satisfying because if there were no greater gods or rightness that could stop him in his ambitions, and they had not, then he now was God over his own realm, unquestioned, bargain sealed, and her life and mind his. With that came the knowledge that had he been capable of grace, he would have given her back to Garrus Fanning when he demanded Sennar let her go. It had been possible, even then, sever her contact with her original body and transfer her to the shell and give them to each other. Die himself, transfer himself into the shell that destroyed all life on the Citadel. It would have been fitting. It would have been true. His answer, however, never, was a Drell man's answer, not a god's, not a scion of justice like Garrus Fanning, or sacrifice as Cara Fanning. As a pantheon, they were exceptional. As a small, petty creature, he was easily replaced by the trillions just like him. To be elevated to godhood in that moment where they ascended to their natures would make him a god of spite. And that was not a comforting thing. That did not mean he would reject spite's gifts. He would, however, consider his new role as god, freed of all prior concerns. He did not wish for spite to touch her, and that he did not know how to prevent. Had there been fate, if there had been gods, they should have aided the Turian in that moment, granted him a miracle, set her spirit back in her body. Had she been a goddess, she would have found a way. Sennar had near anticipated, near hoped that it would happen, for her head to lift from his shoulder, for her to smile at him. It would have been a rightness. Instead, Garrus Fanning walked away with her limp body and nothing else. No vengeance, no... What Sennar would likely remember for eternity was the man's voice and eyes as he asked Sennar to build her a library. The Turian, knowing he had no time left, he had to save his people. He could not put her body or her directives down, even knowing both were potentially empty and always would be. He had used his voice to ask for something to make her life better, whatever her life would be. The Turian had passed each test, and the final judgment of Garrus Fanning in Sennar Tualan's mind was that the Turian was superior, deserving, and inspiring. And in his way. Asking for a solution to reverse bond had been Sennar's idea, and Cara had embraced it, wishing to set Vicarian free. Sennar had wished to see Vicarian give up all hope of her, have her out of his blood and mind because she did not belong to him, and he had no right to her. Cara had wished her bondmate to be free of suffering in her name. Sennar and Cara had agreed to take that action for separate motivations, and could both bear with any or either outcome, and Sennar could not decide if Garrus was a fool or a hero. In many ways, it did not matter. Before his bond, the Turian had embodied her mission, her hope, had likely preserved his own people because he had been inspired, as she intended, to preserve rather than destroy. If Senar had an eternity, and he would never match that level of dedication. The Turian had already chosen her as Ava, without blood, without bond, and in some ways the physical representation mattered nothing, there or gone, with the resonance of who they were as people to each other, and how they wished to extend that strength to others. In her eyes and heart, to break bond had been the only real choice, and the only miracle she could offer him. Some anchor to reality, to prove she had not been a mirage. A chance beyond his mere survival, to prove she had come and gone. She had thought of him alone. She had offered him every choice she could in the brief moments she had. Whatever he was, Garrus Fanning loved Cara, and Senar would have eternity to decide whether or not truly loving someone meant letting them go. He already knew his answer, and it would not change. If love demanded he let her go, then he did not love her. The lesson was not in the question, but in the answer. As always, create the answer, and the question no longer mattered. Even Garrus Fanning would never have had 100% of her, because she had always been aimed straight at the heart of whatever impossible problem she could cast herself toward. The Turian had more of herself given whole in those few moments than Senar had, or potentially would ever experience. He could, however, demand it, take it, own it, and she would give. She was her own answer to the question. Her light would not go out. He would feed it and tend it, feed her and tend her, and she would warm and inspire him, and that was not something that he would ever abandon. He would not alter or change her unless she chose. She would remain human for as long as she wished. It was possible to forgo hunger, sleep, even breathing now. They could inhabit any bodies they chose. For now, he would not give up the longed-for desire to sleep, with his chest to her back, with his hand in her hair, with her soft breathing, and now with him able to touch her mind, to join her in her dreams. That was his ambition of the moment. Patient exploration of her mind, her body, her delicate and vicious turns and curves. If he were to torture her, perhaps he would place all knowledge there was to be had in her mind in a blindingly painful moment, beyond which she would not be able to enjoy gathering facts like flowers in a bouquet. He could always take it away from her. Yet knowing her, that would be like placing the knowledge of music in her mind, and her composition from that day forward would be a thing to behold, in depth and breadth of goddess-like achievement of Nafisi. For now, they would retain their seeking and striving spirits housed in bodies that would never die of thirst, but would feel it. He wished to keep his hunger for her body and mind. That had been the entire purpose of her, and he would not allow her sacrifice to go unappreciated. What he had to offer her was for her to know that if he asked her to give everything of herself, he would not abandon her. She desired to be desired. She wanted to be wanted. She had spent her life isolated and reaching out to the inanimate to replace the loss of the loving voices of her parents. He would provide. He would be animate. He would be her voices. He would even be her loving voices. She did want him. She would want him. And that was a pleasure he would not deny himself or her. He would not take from her the love of gallifant arts by depriving her of hunger. He would keep her from its ruinous edge, and she would not die from it. She would yearn and be fed. She would not starve and be abandoned to that darkness alone. Perhaps someday they would explore having no hunger, having no desires, knowing all, being the gods of replete omniscience. If she did not desire to be that goddess, he would not force it upon her. Or not today. To see love given freely and not traded for greater value. He must admit it had been a beautiful thing, and he could see why the expense could be afforded by whole people. He was not a whole person. Perhaps he could be, given time. Considering her fate, however, perhaps her truest love was an impossible problem such as the one he presented, something and someone at whom she could direct all her energy, all her thought, all her spirit. That is my answer to the question, answer, and challenge her eyes pose. I have eternity with her to be her problem. He wished to be taught what love was, now that he was free to experience it without fear. But perhaps love could not exist without that fear. A question to ask her, perhaps. Loving Garrus Fanning had been something she wanted for herself, but she took so little of the world for herself that she took nothing of his, though he had wanted to give it all. I will and have taken everything of hers. I will give everything back, except her freedom. Had she ever been free? He truly did not know. She had been brave and not wise. She has been distracted, and so have I, but now I have all the time in existence. No fear of pursuit, no fear of betrayal. She is mine. He would go to her, and soon. But he wished to give her some privacy and respect for her grief. He felt it with her. She was crying. She would likely cry for eternity if he did not stop her. She would have no real needs that stopped her tears unless he created them. She would not know the outcome of her gamble, of delivering her fire into the hands of her bondmate. She would never know whether he would be burned alive or would have his path lit by that flame. She did not know what Senar had told Garrus Fanning, and he wondered if she ever would. They shared minds, but she did not wish to see into his thoughts, did not trust them, did not venture there. Again. Had he feelings? He would have sworn they were hurt. They would mend, he was assured, and he would not burden her with how her reaction to him hurt his non-existent feelings that were, in fact, ego. In all truth and honesty, he did not know if she would hide her tears from him or step into his arms and cry while his fingers stroked through her hair. And he comforted her as he knew he could, as she knew he could. She had wanted to release Garrus from bond, but also had wished to find a way to communicate with him. It had been possible. Shepard could be known to be dead and gone to all others, but she had wished to find a way to speak to Garrus, since he knew she was still alive somewhere. She could not create it on her own, had to ask, and Sinar would not permit it under any circumstances. Nothing would be in the case beyond a dermal patch that would reverse bond. Nothing would be in the message beyond her chosen and observed words. Nothing would be planted or placed that could create or maintain a link between them. The opportunity given was intended to sever that link cleanly. It had been severed, but had also been strengthened. Body denied, but spirit assured, without doubt. Sinar had been in her mind, had been able to watch, to redirect, to warn her when she was approaching losing her link, because she came too close to truths or lies or Turian hide in ways that displeased him. So if he were to test his perspective and newfound conscience, which did not qualify, he knew immediately that if she came to him now and pleaded to be permitted to go back in time and do it again, and be given a way to stay in touch with her bondmate, her argument had been sound. Garrus would not be immortal. What was 120 more years against eternity? Absolutely not, Dralava. Never. Sinar was not a changed man, but he no longer doubted that Cara Fanning had been in love with Garrus Fanning. What he had stolen had been beyond the fate of one woman who sought her own death with each breath. He had robbed them both. He had robbed their forged spirit in the Turian sense of its fruition. Something glorious. In Sinar's inverted world, he often forgot that charm and venom blur did not, in fact, change objective truths. He had made it so Cara had been unable to rely on reality for her information. That doubt had haunted her eyes and her thoughts. He had not been the sole cause of her doubt, or the reason why she had been so prone. But Garrus Fanning had had no doubt, and now neither did Sinar. Sinar had learned a great deal about puppetry lately because he had needed to create a Shepard whole after Cara had damaged her ears when she was unreachable. When he had consulted Reaper capability and discovered bodies could be shaped and altered and controlled. He had been Shepard for several reports to the Normandy, his control projected into a shell of her. He, they, could be anybody. Sinar could be Garrus Fanning, if he wished. A set piece of a cabin on the Normandy and the belief that she was with her bondmate, and he could have everything they might have shared. Perhaps a task for later. At the moment, he did not believe that he could duplicate the expression in Garrus Fanning's eyes, and the idea of doing so was distasteful. He could not decide the reasons why he would reject an otherwise fascinating idea, except that the Turian deserved respect even if he got none from fate or gods, and perhaps Sennar would grant it to him for his service and sacrifice. In her name, Garrus had honored his Ava's blessings and directives, and Sennar would honor that man. That choice made upon seeing the Turian's face, eyes, and hearing his voice with Kara's shell in his arms. In the meantime, for the answers to the questions he asked himself, perhaps he must consult her. He was the potential god of his own freedom, but only took it for himself, would never grant it to her. Before him lay every possibility of every library of recorded lives she had struggled to preserve and wished to learn about. He would not care for them until she cared for them, and then she would bring them to life for him. He would build for her new lives, new goals, new freedoms to explore. The music of Nafisi would play between them, her ears whole and her mind always open to him. He was in mental contact with her always now. The power he had over her, near absolute. He could compel at a distance, and she could not hide from him or disobey. She would want to answer to his call. Can love be earned without fear or freedom? Can an infinity of time, of energy, of devotion be of value when that time, energy, and devotion are all inexhaustible? Was giving of any value when there was no need? He had nothing at the moment to gift or offer to her, and he knew well enough to never build her Mindwar or ask her to share her memories of her parents. There were things she owned that were private, and he would respect. But her body was not one of those things. Her parents' voices would remain their own. Garrus Fanning's eyes would remain his own. He wondered if he simply withdrew from her, would she come to him in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, wishing his presence? Would loneliness and isolation and her boredom drive her to him to ask him for a book, for a conversation, for his touch? He nearly smiled. No, not his Cara. He must provide the impetus, and that was his burden and privilege. He had not yet memorized her new body, restored in so many ways, but the constellation of freckles unmapped on her skin. The larger questions of his freedom became defined by the answer of his desire to see her. Knowing it would not become easier to speak to her, he could offer her no gift or understanding that would offset the fact that he had taken her life, taken her choices, taken her bondmate, and taken her purpose. He could not give her love or freedom, but he could give her devotion, desire, the knowledge he had gained of her body and mind. He could spare her his spite. He could exercise his own freedom. He could ask her the meaning of things he did not comprehend. He must forge a path because she would sit in silence and tears and deprivation unending if he did not care for her, just as it had been in the beginning. The woman of dead and dark eyes. He must accept that at the moment she was not of a mind to celebrate their victory, because it was his victory and her loss. They had remained in the same room of the Reaper, sufficient space and staging areas. He had no gifts, but he could spare her his cruelties. It had been necessary for her to know he created her reality at the time, but he would not wake her before a mirror again. He would not create a throne for her to occupy with him. He must not gloat. That would be difficult, as he wished to gloat. He deliberately removed all the staging significance of the control chair and the screens, created instead a drill tent, such as one found in the sands of Rakana, strewn with pillows, no seat of importance, adorned with glowstone and starlight. Control over her was subtle. He could and did suggest to her that she wished to see him. She would not know. The impulse was from him. She would experience it as her own. She would know where he was, know where to seek him, know where to find him, and he would be inspired by her. This he knew as truth. She was in the body she wished, dressed as she wished, and it suited her. He did not desire a change, but granted her as near to previously denied authenticity in her as could be managed. The fabric was fine, and she was no longer a pet, but an intended partner, no matter how long that took. He had all the time he needed. He wished for a partner. He wished for symbiosis. He was still incapable of trust, and at no point would she gain control over the Reaper in which they traveled. He suspected a test of love would be to remove the Reaper technology from her head that assured his life, and that would not happen. He suspected a test of love would be to partner in direction or destination, and that would not happen. They were headed for dark space, and there they would remain on course, a near straight line, to places where nothing existed but them. If they ever encountered another source of light in the distance, they would change course and stay in the darkness, beyond all reach of other influence, beyond reach of her control. They were both immortal. As of last week, consciousness capable of independent isolation, only her body redesigned to match her natural appearance. As always, so much difficulty to go to in order to appear natural. The urge to see him cleared her mind of all other concerns. His call to her, removing all negative associations and pain. She knew briefly she had momentarily been caught in grief, and now she wondered why she had been crying, and turned toward him. She was relieved to feel better, to have a purpose, to remember her blessings and her gifts, to remember the man who loved her, waiting for her patiently until she remembered him. She knew everything, but he was and would always be her paramount concern when he chose for that to be so. With him partially reclined on the pillows, she smiled at him as though she were so very clever in finding him. He did not wish to disagree. She knelt on his thighs, the position of him being her throne possible because she was so small in comparison. Her hands rested on his shoulders. His hands moved to her hips as she leaned in and kissed him. And he was inspired.